So these days I'm a writer, and my book on the art of productive disagreement is in the lobby, so I look forward to some objections and arguments later on. But before I became a writer and started writing about culture and technology and politics and business, I worked in advertising. That was my first career. So for the first sort of 15 years of my adult life, I was an advertising strategist working on big global brands in London and in New York for a few years. So I have been in the belly of the beast. That's what I'm here to tell you. And I have to tell you, it was a lot of fun. And what I'm going to talk to you about now is what I think is a really fascinating chapter in the kind of evolution of advertising that roughly coincided with my entrance into the industry at the end of the 20th century and roughly ended when I left. This is correlation, not causation, right? But it's a particular kind of a period in advertising I think is really interesting. And the top line is that it was a period in advertising when the ethos and spirit and sort of rhetoric of 1960s counterculture was appropriated and used to build very successful consumer brands and consumer campaigns. So there's I don't know how many of you have seen Mad Men, but there's a reference to what I'm talking about right at the end, the finale of the last season of Mad Men. So this is Don Draper. So Don Draper is a very kind of, he's the main character of the series. He's a very traditional, conservative 1950s, masculine kind of a guy. He's always wearing a suit and tie. And part of the drama of the series is we track him and America's culture through the 60s. So as this kind of cultural revolution happens in the 1960s, all sorts of cultural norms are overturned. We see Don becoming increasingly kind of disoriented by what's going on. He's kind of fascinated by the youth, the counterculture. He's a little bit at sea as well. And by the end of it, he goes, right at the end of the last series, he goes on this road trip from New York, Madison Avenue, to California, the West Coast, the kind of epicenter of youth counterculture, and has a kind of spiritual crisis at the same time, and ends up at this meditation retreat. And there's a Coke machine there, which he helps to fix because he's the only kind of grown-up who knows how to fix things. And there's a very kind of clever moment right at the end of that show where he's meditating, and and by the way, as he's on this road trip, he's trying to solve a business problem, which is that his biggest client, Coca Cola, he works for the advertising agency McCann Erickson. They have the biggest client, Coca Cola. They've asked him to come up with a new campaign, and he's struggling to get one. And as he's meditating, a little smile appears. He has this thought, and the show kind of segues into what was actually a real, I'm sure you know this ad, real Coca-Cola ad, I'd like to teach the world to sing, from around the same time. So it's a kind of clever segue back to the reality of what was going on. So I'd like to teach the world to sing, a group of young kind of hippie-ish people, all different religions, different ethnicities, different creeds, all kind of coming together to, well, in this case to sing, I'd like to buy the world a Coke, but there's also a kind of sense of idealism, and it's based on some of the kind of imagery and pictures from the 1960s, moments like Hey Jude with the Beatles, but also there's a kind of indirect connection to some of the political events that were going on in the late 1960s and so on. So what's going on here is that Don, who never went along with the counterculture, he never wore a paisley shirt or grew a beard, right? He didn't like any of that stuff. He sees right at the turn of the decade that actually, there's a chance here I can actually use all this talk about global peace and cultural revolution to sell sugared water, and comes up with this incredibly successful campaign. So in a sense, this was the kind of beginning of what I'm talking about, this kind of countercultural branding. But it really doesn't come into its own until at least 10 years later, really kind of 10, 15 years later. And it really kind of starts to come into its own, I think, when the next generation, the kind of next generation down from Don Draper, who are the kids in the 60s, grow up and found their own businesses, or become senior in ad agencies and marketing organizations, and start applying this ethos quite sincerely in a way. I don't think they're necessarily doing it cynically to their brands. I'm sure you know this ad, definitely one of the, within the advertising industry, considered maybe the greatest ad of all time, where Apple just ran it once during the Super Bowl, and there's a kind of 1984 scenario, and there's a big brother on this grey screen. There's lots of grey people chanting in response. And down the aisle comes this brilliant individual woman and kind of smashes the screen. And the line at the end says, "This is why 1984, which is the year it ran, will not be like 1984." Now, this is an incredible act of chutzpah. What's going on here? His analogy was IBM is like Big Brother, and we're up against this grey, faceless 1950s style corporation, and we're here to smash it and disrupt it. So he's turned the marketing of his product into a whole ideological, social cause, into a movement that people can join, where we're not just coming here to buy a product and can be useful for me or help me with my business and so on. We're coming together to change the world. We're coming together to make a dent in the universe, as Steve Jobs liked to say. And subsequently, Apple, is obviously the biggest and most influential example. And by the way, I'm focusing on America a lot, but that's partly because America is just the center of marketing and advertising. So everywhere else, including Britain, was heavily influenced by what was going on there. But other brands as well. So Nike, Starbucks in Britain and elsewhere, Virgin, really adopted a very similar ethos. And in fact, around this time, this is kind of the end of the 90s when I came into the advertising industry, absolutely every brand wanted to build a social movement, and they would always say, so what do we stand for? What's our belief? Every brand needed to have a manifesto. What's our manifesto? Even when, seeing as we're in Sweden, when IKEA entered the British market, the campaign they ran was called Chuck Out the Chintz. Chintz, very kind of traditional old-style form of British furniture. And they had kind of, there was lots of singing, so that's no coincidence. Groups of people singing up in cities up and down the country, the Chuck Out Your Chintz song. And it was a very conscious kind of Apple-style campaign where we say we're going to build this big social movement where it's not just come to our shops and buy our nice furniture. It's let's change the country, right? Let's transform the country. And indeed, that's what IKEA did. So well done them. So what's going on here? David Wootton talked so eloquently about the subtleties of marketing and branding. We still tend to think of it as a way of selling product features and saying, well, what's the function of this product? Let me tell you why it's better than product B. Or sometimes we say, oh, well, there's a status angle as well. People want to show off. And sometimes we'll admit there's some sort of emotional kind of content to brands and so on. But brands sell themselves in all sorts of subtle ways. And what I find fascinating about this story is the endlessly inventive nature of capitalism and marketing, where you take any kind of energy that's going on in the culture and you use it to sell stuff. So the 1960s counterculture was, in theory, at least somewhat oppositional to the market, right? There was a kind of reaction to what people regarded as, the younger generation regarded as a kind of dumb consumerism of the 1950s and early 1960s. And they were saying, there's truths, there are higher truths that are beyond the market, and we're kind of creating this kind of cultural revolution, which might be involved in consumerism, but it actually goes way beyond it. And what Apple and the others realized is that, yeah, this is a tremendous way to sell stuff. And you can actually create cultural and ideological differentiation around your brand, as well as emotional or product differentiation. And you can use these countercultural values of rebellion and nonconformity and sticking one up to the establishment, and try to seek these higher truths of self-expression, and make them work for you. Nike is a good example. I just use this particular ad because they really kind of state the case so plainly here. So this used to be the only way yes, this is the only way to play tennis, ironically, and this is your grammar, haha. But basically, here's the tennis establishment, conservative, stiff, old-fashioned. Along comes Agassi, and he smashes it up, and they sort out sports stars who were rebellious in some way. Agassi kind of famously didn't like wearing the kind of whites at Wimbledon and was a rebellious figure in lots of ways. You can't really see what's at the top there, but their internal mantra at the time was irreverence justified. So they were always looking for sports stars or stories about sports which incorporated an element of irreverence and rebellion, which was justified by their talent. So that's Nike, but let's return to Apple, because Apple is really kind of at the center of this story, and the apotheosis of this form of branding, I think, is the Think Different campaign, which came about. Actually, the ad agency I worked with, I didn't have anything to do with it, but it was Chiat Day at the end of the 90s, when Steve Jobs returned from his 40 days in the desert, from his exile, came back to Apple to save it. And under him, his agency created this campaign where I won't play the TV ad, but this is the kind of poster version. But essentially, they had lots of famous kind of creative visionaries, and they wrote a little kind of script which was about saying, change is driven by the crazy ones, right? And if you're one of us, if you're one of these creative people, these visionary people, and you want to change the world, and you then come with Apple and think different. Of course, it should have been think differently, but the Americans were not really into grammar in that sense. They did have actually a big argument about that, and I think it was Jobs who took the final decision on the grounds of economy, one less syllable. And then, even more explicitly, they start using imagery from these late 1960s kind of peace campaigns. Again, Jobs was sincere. He was a child of the 60s. He loved all this stuff. And he goes out of his way to get permission to use imagery of John and Yoko having a bed in. And the most extraordinary example, I think, is this. This is Rosa Parks, right? So it's an example of using an icon of political revolution in the 1960s, or certainly political change, and slapping her on a bus in order to sell computers. I just think it's wonderful. Okay, I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to say why this window is now closed. You don't get countercultural branding anymore. This was something that kind of came and took over the advertising industry and has now gone away. The moment you knew it was dead was when, during the Black Lives Matter in 2020, Pepsi got Kendall Jenner to put her in an ad with a can of Pepsi, handing it to the protesters. And there was so much kind of anger about this that they had to withdraw the ad and apologize and say, I'm sorry, that was a really stupid thing to do. And at that point, you can't pull this trick anymore. Why is that? 3 reasons. Well, one, and the most obvious one, it was incredibly successful and turned these companies into huge global behemoths, including, of course, in particular, Apple. It's one of the biggest mega companies in the world. So it's very hard to play the kind of plucky upstart disrupting the system when you are the system, right? The most obvious kind of point. Second, the counterculture really became the culture. So just culturally, the same thing happened as happened commercially with Apple, which is a lot of these values of self-expression and diversity and inclusion and anti-racism and so on became the kind of dominant corporate culture. And so just talking about, Nike did a reasonably good job here with Copenhagen and Black Lives Matter, but it didn't really have the same resonance because it's just kind of much more conventional now, this kind of approach, this kind of language. It's become woven into the, you know, the protocols of HR departments. It's just not very exciting anymore. And then the third reason is again, really talking about America specifically here. It's incredible political polarization that's going on. Bud Light used a trans influencer to do a little campaign for them. And somebody found out, some activists found out, right-wing activists, consumers organized a boycott of it. And one thing led to another. They handled it very badly. And Bud Light lost several points of market share, which is really hard to do if you're that big a brand. But it actually led to a drop in the profits of Anheuser-Busch's of its parent company, which is actually incredibly impressive fuck up. Excuse my language. But it happens because American society is now so culturally polarized. So you can still play the kind of, Ben and Jerry's was part of this movement, and they still kind of do it, but now they're much more hard-edged and political, and they're not saying, you know, everyone come with us, you can all kind of change the system. They're saying, these are our people over here, left-wing young progressives. And the rest of you, the more angry you get, the better, because we've targeted our little segment here. So they've got this very hard edge. Join the pecan resist movement. But yeah, they make kind of pro-Palestine statements all the time. They're basically kind of AOC-style activists now. And of course, you get counter movements on the other side, a coffee brand that says, we'll wake you up, but we're not going to make you woke. So, you know, you're seeing this kind of political fragmentation of the brand landscape as well. So you can't have these kind of big overarching things. So I'm just going to finish with Innocent. Maybe, you know, in some ways the last gasp, at least in Britain, of this style of branding. They emerged in the sort of early 2000s, I think, founded by a bunch of young idealistic guys who wanted to do fruit juice without any of the additives, and also to be really good guys and to be allied with philanthropy and charity and so on, and made a hugely successful brand. And this story comes to an end in about 2009, I think, when they sell to Coca Cola. So, thank you very much.
I've never worked in advertising myself, but I've at times earlier in my career been an advertiser, and I've had other reasons to look into the industry press of the business. Mm. And sometimes I get the feeling that the will to sell has been lost. Mm. There was an enthusiasm about campaigning, about undertaking real efficient campaigns 30 years ago. And nowadays it's much more about pontificating and doing the exact right thing and sort of lecturing your customers. Is there anything to that, you think?
That's interesting. What I have seen is it used to be, in business terms, almost a kind of branch of the humanities. So you could get people like me who did English literature or whatever, and who were kind of interested in lots of different things. And you go into advertising, and you'd have these fascinating debates about what's the cultural meaning of this brand. We're selling meaning. We're not just selling a product, for God's sake. We're intelligent people here. That doesn't really exist anymore. Now it's much more about how do you get the most efficiency out of every pound, and in particular, of course, how do you use technology to do that? So it's become a much more systematized industry and less of a kind of humanistic, meaning-based one. And I think you see that kind of reflected in the ads. You know, people don't really have favorite campaigns anymore, at least not in Britain. Yeah. I'm glad I did it when I did it, and I'm glad I'm not in it anymore.